this video, we're going to be talking about children and the boundaries that they have, and the fact that sometimes, unfortunately, we know that people will not respect children's boundaries. Children have the right to say what is comfortable or uncomfortable for them, and they have that agency over their own bodies.
Right. Children should be afforded their privacy too, so not only just what's comfortable for them or their bodies, but also what they're comfortable with in general and who they're comfortable around. So they may have moments where they're starting to learn about their bodies and differences with people, and they might start to ask for some privacy at times. And at that point, when they start to request it, it's important for us to respect them and respect that bit of discomfort that's telling them that they would like that privacy.
Absolutely. And particularly when we're talking about places where there might be some acceptable levels of nudity, for example, a locker room. When you've got a really young child that needs to be with their primary caregiver, no matter if they're the same gender as that caregiver or not, it's perfectly acceptable for them to be with that person. So, even a mom of a son would be absolutely fine to take a very young child into a locker room. But at a certain age, it might make that child feel uncomfortable. It might make other people uncomfortable. And a lot of places, like locker rooms, gyms, pools, things like that, will sometimes even have a sign up that says that children above a certain age who are of the opposite gender cannot be in that room. Now, if it's the same gender of their primary caregiver, then that's obviously the room that they would be in no matter what. So that's not a concern. But again, it's for the child's comfort, but it's also for the comfort of the other people around them.
And as kids become aware of their bodies, there are going to be moments where they are noticing their own bodies and other people's bodies, and that can make them and others around them comfortable or uncomfortable. And it's important for children to know what those boundaries are, and that there are moments in time where they may need to be in points of nudity around somebody else. Like, for example, if they are dressing, or they need some help bathing, or at the doctor's office, or with a nurse. There may be some discomfort that, as much as we want to respect them and their boundaries there, that discomfort might even need to be necessary.
Right. Especially, when we're talking about kids, we're, at a certain point, they're able to dress themselves. They're able to bathe themselves. And there's not really necessarily just one age that is. I mean, children develop at different times. But at the point at which they can do those things for themselves, they really should. And particularly when it comes to the private parts of their body. And when we refer to the private parts of a child's body, or frankly of anyone's body, we're talking about the parts of our body that would be covered by underwear.
So boys, we might be looking at just the underwear on the bottom, but for girls, we're looking at both top and bottom as well when we're talking about private parts too.
Absolutely. One of the things that's important to know is that for children, adult behaviors just aren't acceptable and appropriate, and sometimes even not legal. So, children really in our culture are seen as vulnerable and in need of protection.
And in this country, an adult is considered someone who is 18 or over. So we are talking when we're talking about children, we're not just talking about those under the age of 12 or so, but we're really talking about anyone under the age of 18. And we have a lot of different laws that really help to make certain that they are protected as children because of that vulnerability.
Absolutely. And those laws range from everything to when they're allowed to work, what they need to be doing with their time, like going to school, and things that are okay for adults to make choices about, like tobacco, alcohol, and sexual contact as well. So we do want to say that while each state has some laws that are a little bit different, generally speaking, children who are at or under the level of puberty are not able to make decisions regarding sex or sexual activity. They're not able to consent by law. But that gets a little bit different when it comes to teens.
Right. With teens, that may change depending on the state that each person is in. So that law is something that you would want to make certain you're aware of for your own state. But even then, when it is a teenager, if there are sexual relations going on, those are things that within a peer relationship, so within teens who are of the same age or very close to age, generally is not considered unusual or
Illegal.
Illegal, yes.
Yeah.
Now, appropriateness may vary family to family and person
Absolutely.
to person.
The law recognizes that people at different age have different understandings of sex, different understandings of consent and of consequences. And so those laws do differ, but just tended to keep in mind that teenagers amongst themselves, if they're at that same level, generally not illegal. You may not agree with it, but generally not illegal. But when there's a larger gap, then that becomes a big problem.
And even with teens who may find, dating partners for each other or with each other, there's still an element of choice as to who it is that they may decide to date, as to who it is that they want to interact with. Now, sometimes they might be finding themselves kind of driven towards dating within particular groups.
Maybe even within their culture, they may feel, or a family or someone may say, we really feel strongly about you eventually pairing up with someone of a similar group. And that's not unheard of by any means, but even then, there's still that element of choice. That the person would be able to decide for themselves when they're an adult.
And marriage before adulthood is not something that typically is happening either.
No.
And again, it comes back to that idea that children have the right to decide what's okay for them or what's not okay.
And also the idea that children don't have the same understandings and need to be protected.
Right.
So we don't have betrothals from an early age. We don't have people generally picking out their spouses.
We'd like to focus in a little bit more on some of the younger situations, because what we find is if we talk about boundaries and children and people crossing those boundaries, oftentimes if we're looking at a crossing of the boundaries in a sexualized manner, we aren't talking about teenagers for the most part. We're really talking about those who are even younger than teenagers, or those people before puberty. Even if we include those who are teens, this is something that does happen more often than we'd like to have occur.
So in other words, people who are doing sexual things to children who are too young to consent, or people who are just ignoring the boundaries, physical boundaries of kids and teens. This is something that occurs fairly often. By the time that people would reach adulthood at age 18, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys has experienced some form of sexual violence. In other words, a time that someone was doing something sexual to them that either they didn't want to happen or were too young to be able to have a say.
Or it might even include someone acting out or doing things sexual in front of that child, or that's inappropriate for that child to see because of their age and because of their experiences. So it doesn't even have to be necessarily the physical boundary being crossed, but some of that emotional boundary and the idea that this is not content that children should know about or are
Not
aware
age
of.
appropriate.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we're talking about younger children and the fact that these things happen, we need to be very clear about who is doing these things. So perpetrators is the word that we would use. Perpetrator being someone who is doing these things to a child. A perpetrator might be someone who is an adult, a teen, maybe even an older child. Someone else who is acting on that child and doing something sexual to them.
And they're not often strangers. In fact, most of the time, they're going to be somebody that child knows. It might be a trusted friend, it might be a trusted neighbor, it might be someone of authority figure for them, or even within their own family.
It's important for us to be able to tell our children that they can tell anybody no. That if someone is doing something uncomfortable to them, especially regarding their private parts, they have the right to say no if they can, and to tell somebody, to tell another adult who can help them out. and we're, I think we'll probably end up saying that a few times, but it is really important that we communicate that to children, that no matter who it is, as we said at the beginning, children have the right to say what they're comfortable with and not comfortable with. And if at any point they are uncomfortable with something that someone is doing to them, they can always say so and then tell somebody else.
Especially because as we go and talk about children and the perpetrators for children, it's often something that's built on trust.
Mm-hmm.
And it's somebody who uses that trust as almost a method to be able to gain access to that child in a way to have time with that child, in a way to build the child's trust and the family's trust.
I was going to say, as you're discussing it, really, it points out that you would have to build the trust of the family to be able to get with that child. So, even parents who are going to be very protective, if this is a trusted family or friend or someone who's helping out, they would have to convince you as a parent that they are a safe person. They also have to convince the child, but I think sometimes we're more protective over our kids than kids are, because they're used to doing what the adults tell them to do.
Mm-hmm. And there's actually a word for the behaviors that people might use in order to gain those trusts and to build that trust with both the family and the child. And that's what we call grooming. It's kind of a process that they go through in order to gain the trust of everyone involved. And in many ways, it may feel even like they're filling a need for somebody, making things more easy in a way for everyone to be able to trust them even more.
Yeah. So they might start off with gaining the trust of the family, which might include things like helping out, maybe if people are working a lot, maybe it's helping with groceries or transportation.
Or maybe they're not so handy around the house, so they might be coming in and offering to do repairs. Or if there's a situation where maybe it's a single parent who might feel a little overwhelmed, offering to take care of the children often.
Yeah. And that person is not going to be someone the kids are afraid of. They're going to be someone the kids feel very comfortable with, and usually a number of people feel comfortable with them. Sometimes if this is someone who is really looking to exploit that relationship, they may have a lot of toys and video games or cool things that kids would really like, and maybe their parents can't afford, or they can't really spend that kind of time with them doing that. But then if you look into that person's life, maybe they don't even have kids, but they have all of those fun toys.
Right, so there are some signs that we can look for even along the way to kind of maybe raise our awareness of whether this person's motives are for good or for bad, because we're not saying every person out there who offers to help is a bad person.
Fortunately, there's a lot of good people in the community who help out people who are single moms or who need a little bit of help or who are just being neighborly and friendly, and we don't want to discourage that at all.
But we do want you to be aware that that's often a way that people may start with grooming behaviors. And so it's looking at, is this person spending more time with the children than they're spending with the adults? Mm-hmm. Do they have those kinds of gadgets and things, toys, games that children might like, but don't seem to engage in activities with the adults or conversations with the adults?
Do we see them having adult interactions? Are their adult interactions as comfortable as the interactions they have with children? Are they the person who's always going towards the kids and are very, very uncomfortable with the adults, or maybe trying too hard to be friendly with the adults? Are they offering a little too soon to watch the kids? What we know is that oftentimes people who are going to try to take advantage of these situations are looking for a need to fill. They're looking for maybe a child who has some vulnerabilities. Maybe that child doesn't fit in very well at school or is being picked on. Maybe the family is, very busy, working. Parents might be working a couple jobs just to keep enough money coming in, but then the child is maybe on their own a little bit more, or kind of craving some adult attention. We mentioned single parents. Mm-hmm. If you have maybe a single mom who doesn't have a dad in the home, you know, that person may come in as a father type figure and do some sort of things that dad might do.
Or another sign you might see is if they're singling out one child. So maybe it's a family with multiple children, but they seem to kind of focus in on one or want to spend more one-on-one time. Or they maybe are talking with all the children, but instead of doing group activity or things together as groups, try to maybe get one child more alone or more separated, or children at one time by themselves.
One of the things we know about this is that people who are going to try to do that grooming that you mentioned are sometimes going to push some boundaries with the kids pretty early on, just to see how that child will react. You know, is that child the kind of kid who's going to say no and who's going to talk to a parent or another trusted adult? Or is that child someone who can be kind of pushed into things? And so it might be something like a touch on a leg or an arm that might be a little inappropriate, but again, that person is gauging the child's reaction and how do they react to that.
Or it might be tickling or wrestling in ways that start to make that child feel uncomfortable. And they're looking at, you know, when the child says stop and you continue, does that child continue to resist, or are they okay with that?
Sometimes we should say it's not even a physical thing always. It might be, can they keep a secret from their parents? Like maybe their parents don't want them to have a certain toy, or maybe their parents don't allow them to have a certain kind of food or drink. And so this person's going to allow them to have that or get it for them. And how does that child react with that secrecy? Do they tell people? Do they not?
And we even see that as it progresses into sexual assault. They may be using other activities to keep this child under their control, to have them keep this a secret. So you might find them engaging in things like tobacco use or having alcohol, so that it's like they're both committing this crime, and the child feels like, because it's both of them, that they'll keep that secret so that they don't get in trouble too.
Right. And it may not even be something that is against a law. It might just be breaking a family rule. Or sometimes if they're doing some sort of sexual activity, they'll video or film that or take pictures and then say, you know, tell that child, as that child, you know, is further in the process and starts to sort of back away, they might say, well, I will show this to your parents and you'll be in trouble. Or I'll pass this around, I will expose what you have done. And they really manipulate that child and take it away from the fact that they're the older person, they're knowing what they're doing, and they are knowingly trying to talk that child into it and keep that child from saying something, but making that child feel as though they are also a part of doing something wrong.
And that's really where that grooming is heading. It's really headed to allow that person to feel that they have control and that they can manipulate the child to whatever level of sexual assault they'd like. And again, it's important to realize that not everyone is doing this.
No,
This is not something that all people in the population do. This is something that a very small number of people do, but it's still something that happens far too frequently.
Absolutely. I would think that as parents hearing this, this would be a kind of a frightening thing to hear. And so maybe we should really talk about what parents can do to try to prevent these things from happening.
As it was mentioned, you know, empowering your children to speak up. So recognizing when they're uncomfortable with boundaries and with their boundaries being crossed or their boundaries being pushed, and allowing them to have that ability to say, I don't like this, or I'm uncomfortable, and truly respecting that within your own family and your own household, to make certain that they understand their bodies are theirs and that they have the right for those types of decisions.
And really, we can see this in small times or small areas. If you have a younger child who hasn't seen a family member very often, and maybe, you know, the grandmother or the aunt or whomever comes over, often, you know, the adult who sees this child will say, oh, come give me a hug. And maybe the child doesn't feel comfortable with that. Maybe the child doesn't really know that person or thinks that they don't remember them very much, and that's just not a comfortable thing, and so they'll sort of push back. It's important as adults that we help navigate that situation. If we push that child and say, you have to hug that person, look, you're making them feel very sad, or that person loves you, this is what we do when we love someone, then we're giving them the message that what they want with their body is not as important as what an adult wants them to do. And that's just not a safe message to give them.
Right, so instead we can say things like, you know what, they're not comfortable right now, maybe later. Or, you know, they don't want a hug. Doesn't mean they don't have to be respectful still,
Absolutely.
but maybe there's an offering of something different.
An alternative.
A fist bump, a high five, a handshake, you know, even just a wave or a hand signal to say, you know, yeah, I acknowledge you, I still recognize you as someone important to me, but I'm not comfortable with that. It's not the child's job to make the adult feel good about themselves. It's really, as adults, our job to make sure that the child feels safe and respected and that their boundaries are understood.
And certainly, anytime it comes to a child's private parts, they, you know, should never be forced to expose themselves or to touch an adult or someone else in their private area. So we need to be sure to have these conversations with kids, as uncomfortable as that might sound. But it can just be a normal part of growing up and just a safety lesson. You know, and again, while we don't want to be disrespectful to other adults and to people in general, I think it's very respectful to teach our children that just as we respect the boundaries of someone else, people need to respect our boundaries, whether we're kids or adults. And helping to kind of speak up for the child who might not have that vocabulary yet, but is feeling uncomfortable. Children have those rights just like adults.
And it's important to let our children know who we can talk to. You know, letting them know that there are safe adults that they can go to say if anything feels unsafe or uncomfortable at any point in time. Again, with anyone, so even with someone that they know or trust.